This is the third in a set of videos where we're looking at how to create a basic GUI program. Again, the main focus of these videos is not as much about creating GUI programs using best practices. There's a whole bunch of other reading and learning that needs to happen in order to do that. What we're really interested in is taking the understanding we've developed around classes and objects and put it into practice here in some real situation. So where we left off was we created this frame and then we put a panel on the inside. So the approach we're taking is we have a frame, we put a panel inside, and then we're going to add everything we want to our panel. So the students' rendering that they asked me for was they wanted a couple buttons on the left-hand side, maybe a timer over here. So this aqua line drawn by me represents the frame, and then what I'm trying to say here is that I'm going to put on inside the panel sits inside the frame, so the black thing is this panel. So I'm going to create some buttons and put them onto my actual panel. So the first thing we want to kind of take a look at and familiarize ourselves with are these things called layout managers. There's a whole bunch of predefined layout managers in Java, and what they are is they're essentially rules that have been given to a component about how to add things. So the way we actually added our panel to our frame was the frame.addPanel. And when this occurs, the program will follow the add method will follow some predefined instructions about how to add things into the frame. Now, a lot of programs have a very similar look and feel. So essentially, these different layouts are for programs that look and feel like this. There's no point in reinventing the wheel here. You can use one of them. Now, since in the student's case they want something a little bit more custom, we can't use one of the predefined layouts. What we need to use is a null layout, meaning no layout, and then we have to kind of place everything manually. So if I come into here, the first thing I'm going to do, and let me show this in a different way, I create a J button, B1, and then I come down here. Let's construct the button, and then I'm going to add the button to the panel. So 3 lines I've added. I say I have a field called B1, which is a J button object. I construct the button, and I pass to the constructor the word press me, so that's what will show up on the button. And then I say add it to the panel. So again, I'm adding the button to the panel, and then I add the panel to the frame. So if I run this, I don't see anything. But if I take my mouse and hover over it, it pops up. So we're going to talk about 2 issues here. The first issue is, why doesn't this pop up right when I start my program? Well, we're not going to explore really why that is. We're just going to kind of fix it with a very brief explanation. Remember when we created our panel here and we made this, we wrote an overridden version of the paint method? Well, it turns out the paint method in the superclass, in the component class, has some pretty important instructions in there that helps with this rendering. If I write paint here, let's say I just put paint, well, what the computer is going to do is call this and end up in this infinite loop here. Let's see what happens if I run this. You see what happens? Everything kind of crashes because I'm saying call the paint, call the paint, call the paint. So that's not very good. I want to access the paint in the superclass. So if I write the word super.paint, what that does is it says, I want you to invoke paint, but I want you to invoke the paint in the superclass. So now if I run this, see how the button just appears right away? Perfect. So I need to put in my paint method super.paint, and I need to pass it the graphics object. For now, I would say just put this at the start of every paint method, and as we explore hierarchies in more detail, we'll talk about how to be a little bit more selective in when and how to use this. So the reason why the button gets added there is that the panel has a default layout manager assigned to it. So if I want to place the button in my own little custom location, I'm going to use this method setLayout in the panel, setLayout to null, meaning now there's no layout defined for it. So if I run it, I don't see a button. And that's because by setting the layout to null, there's no longer kind of set instructions about how to put the buttons or different components on the screen. So what I then need to do is I need to use this setBounds method. And what the set bounds does is it sets the X and Y position of the button and the width and the height. And there's my button. So I can place this button wherever I want by, as long as I think of the X and Y position, X, Y, width, and height. So if I want it in the top corner, I'm going to set it to 0, 0. And I'm going to set it, maybe I want it to be a little longer. Maybe I want the button to be 200. I'm going to set it by 300 by 100. I want this program to be for a tablet, so I want to be able to touch it with my finger. And there's my button, so now I can kind of press this. Oh, nothing happens yet. So if I want to add a couple buttons here, I need to actually work out I need to actually kind of visualize this. So I'm going to get my pen out, and I know that my button, if I place my button here, this is 0, 0, and this is 300, and this is 100. If I want another button here, this position is going to be 0 in the X, 100 in the Y. Right? Because top left corner is the XY position, width, and height. So if I come back to my program, I'm going to come up here and make another button. Actually, let's make 2 more buttons. Now I would recommend here using an array list to make your buttons. I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to leave that for you to figure out, but it's going to make manipulation a little easier. And if I scroll down here, what I'm going to do now is I need to construct new J button, and I'm going to put on this don't press me, I don't know, and I'm going to make B3 equals new J button, and this is going to have a bunch of question marks. I don't know, whatever this is going to do. So I go B2.setBounds. So if I want B2 to sit directly below B1, it's going to have an X position of 0, it's going to have a Y position of 100, and it's going to be the same size. It's going to be 300 by 100. And then I have to panel.add B2. So if I run this now, press me, don't press me. And now I'm going to do the same thing for B3. And I'm going to set this to 0 again, so it's going to be 0, 200, 300, 100, and then I need to so if I run this, I should see 3 buttons. There are my 3 buttons. Okay. Now, I want the buttons to do something. So let's just end this video by giving the buttons some functionality. So to do this, what I need to do is I need to add what's called an action listener to these buttons. So again, go out to the internet, and we're going to do a quick Google search for action listener in Java. And you should get, and let's put Java 8. There we go. I'm looking for the actual Oracle documentation here. And you'll notice that an action listener is in fact an interface, not a class. Now, if you're in my class and it's currently November and we haven't learned what interfaces are, a lot of students are using them, and we kind of right now are just kind of learning how to put them in. So we're not going to do a detailed definition of what an interface is, but we'll define a couple little things along the way. So I need to create an action listener in order to attach to the button. So what it essentially does is it basically attaches this thing to the button, and it's like a little guy sitting there saying, have you pressed me yet? 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 And then once it's pressed, it executes a specific method. So if I come up here, I'm going to actually do this in my fields. And so I'm going to say private, and I'm going to say action listener, AL for short, equals new, action listener, and you'll get an error here. And you'll get an option to ask you to create it, but we don't really want to do that. Because an action listener is an interface, we need to actually override all the methods in it. So I'm going to write my typical kind of line to create an object, and then I'm going to open a brace, close a brace, and put a semicolon. And now when I click on this, I should get an option to import the action listener, but I'm still going to have an error, and that error is going to say some interesting things that we're not interested in right now. But if I click on the arrow, it says add unimplemented methods, and you should get one method here. So this is a method called Actionperformed. And what this method does is it fires off whenever an action has occurred. I like to change my predefined parameter to E. So what I can do now is I have this action listener called AL. If I come down to my buttons, what I can do is I can add an action listener to each button. So it turns out we have this nice method called add action listener. Add action listener. So we're going to add the same action listener to every button. Now we could make 3 different action listeners, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually distinguish which button is been pressed up in here. So if I, for now, let's put in here system.println button pressed. Okay? So if I run this now, watch the console. Button pressed, button pressed, button pressed. So by adding the action listener to the button, what happens is essentially this little thing sitting on the button saying, when this button is pressed, I want you to jump up here and run this code. Now right now it's not really useful because it does the same thing for every button. I might want each button to do something slightly different. So what I can do now is this is a perfect example of when to use the object version of the equals method, because when a button is pressed, an action event item is created and passed into here. It turns out that action event item stores who actually was used, which button was pressed. So you'll notice here if I go E dot, and there's a whole bunch of methods, and notice I changed this to E up here, get source, that actually accesses which object called the Actionperformed method. So which object was actually pressed. So I can add a little if statement here. I can say if e.getSource is equivalent to B1. So basically it's saying, is the person who called this B1? If it is, we're going to say system.println B1 pressed. And I'm going to make this for each one. e.getSource B2. B2 pressed. Else if, oops, e.getSource B3. B3 is pressed. So if I run this now, B1 pressed, B2 pressed, B3 pressed. When Actionperformed is called, this action event is generated, which actually contains all sorts of information about the action that has occurred. You know, who's caused the action to occur, when it's caused, all sorts of information. Very similar to when you have a try-catch structure, and when an exception is thrown, that exception stores all sorts of information about that exception. When an action occurs, this action event stores all that information. So let's end this video and do something a little more interesting. When I press this button, let's say I want to create a random, I don't know, number and put it on the button. So it turns out they have this wonderful method called b1.setText. What setText does is it sets the text in your button. So if I go setText and I'm going to write the word code. I'm just doing something kind of random here, and I'm going to say math.random. So I'm essentially going to generate a random integer between 1 and, say, 1,000. So essentially, every time I press this button now, I use B1, and I set the text to the word code with some random number. So now my button label changes every time. So in our next video, what we'll do is we're going to add our kind of game field where we play, and maybe we'll add a timer if we have time. But again, at this point, I suggest you pause and kind of play around with this stuff. Other listeners that are really useful to be aware of is the most motion listener, most motion listener, most listener, key listener. There's a whole bunch of listeners out there. So if you do a Google search for listeners in Java, you'll find all sorts of different listeners that work very similarly to this action listener. I hope this helped.